Close your eyes for a moment and imagine walking through the corridors of time itself. You find yourself in a small room in Virginia Beach where the rhythmic sound of breathing fills the air. On a simple couch lies a man in the deepest trance state ever documented by modern science. His name is Edgar Cayce, and in this moment his consciousness has traveled far beyond the physical realm. The room around him begins to shimmer and fade. In its place, a magnificent hall of light materializes, what Edgar called the Christ Consciousness Records. This isn't a library of books, but a living dimension where the most sacred truths of human existence are preserved in pure light and sound. 7 luminous doorways appear before him, each one pulsing with an ancient wisdom that transcends every religious doctrine ever written. These doorways don't bear the symbols of any earthly faith. Instead, they radiate with cosmic principles that speak directly to the soul, principles that bypass denomination and dogma, leading straight to the heart of the divine. Tonight, you're invited to walk through each of these 7 doorways. You'll discover why these particular lessons have remained hidden from mainstream spirituality, preserved only in the deepest mystical experiences of humanity's most gifted seers. These aren't religious rules handed down by institutions. They're cosmic truths that your soul already knows, waiting to be remembered. But here's what makes this journey different from every other spiritual teaching you've encountered. These 7 lessons don't ask you to believe anything. They don't require you to abandon your current faith or adopt new rituals. Instead, they reveal pathways that already exist within you, divine channels that have been present since the moment your soul first sparked into existence. As we prepare to enter the first doorway, understand that you're about to receive the same teachings that transformed thousands of seekers from spiritual hunger into divine knowing. These aren't theories or philosophies. They're practical, proven methods for experiencing God directly, regardless of your religious background or previous spiritual struggles. The first doorway is beginning to open now, and its light is unlike anything you've ever seen. Edgar Cayce never called himself a prophet, though history would remember him as America's most documented psychic. Over the course of 43 years, while lying in a trance so deep that doctors couldn't detect normal brain activity, he delivered over 14,000 readings that would revolutionize our understanding of consciousness, healing, and the human soul's relationship with the divine. But here's what sets Cayce apart from every other spiritual teacher, channeler, or mystic in recorded history. When asked about the source of his information, he never claimed to contact departed spirits or angelic beings. Instead, his readings consistently identified their source as what he called the universal consciousness, the same divine awareness that flowed through Jesus, Buddha, and every enlightened being who ever walked the earth. More specifically, Cayce's source was identified as the Christ consciousness itself, not Jesus as a historical person, but the cosmic Christ principle, that aspect of divine consciousness that represents perfect unity between human awareness and God consciousness. This wasn't theological doctrine speaking through Edgar Cayce. This was direct download from the highest spiritual dimensions accessible to human consciousness. During his readings, medical doctors would gather around his couch, taking notes as this sleeping man diagnosed illnesses he'd never studied and prescribed treatments that hadn't been invented yet. Archaeologists listened in amazement as he described ancient civilizations with details later confirmed by excavation. Grieving parents received comfort as he spoke with certainty about the continuous journey of souls beyond physical death. But it was in his spiritual readings that something truly extraordinary emerged. When people asked Edgar Cayce about their relationship with God, about prayer, about the purpose of suffering, about the meaning of existence itself, the Christ consciousness spoke through him with such clarity and authority that lives were permanently transformed. These weren't abstract theological discussions. They were practical, specific instructions for direct communion with the divine. People who had struggled for decades with unanswered prayers suddenly found themselves in constant dialogue with God. Individuals who had felt abandoned by the divine discovered they had never been separate from Source for even a single moment. You're about to receive those same teachings. Not second-hand interpretations or scholarly analysis, but the direct spiritual instructions that flowed through Edgar Cayce when he was connected to the highest levels of divine consciousness. These lessons have guided thousands of seekers from spiritual seeking into spiritual being. But first, we need to understand why these teachings were necessary in the first place. Why do human beings, created in the image of God, feel so separated from their divine source? The answer to this question will change everything you think you know about your spiritual journey. Here's the central mystery that Edgar Cayce's readings illuminate with startling clarity. Every soul is literally made of divine essence. You are not a physical being having a spiritual experience. You are a spiritual being, temporarily focused through physical form. Your consciousness is individualized God consciousness. Your awareness is God's awareness, experiencing itself through the unique perspective of your soul. So why do you feel separated from God? Why does divine connection seem like something you must achieve rather than something you already are? The readings revealed that incarnation into physical form creates what we might call spiritual amnesia. The process of focusing consciousness through a physical brain in a dense material dimension naturally creates a temporary forgetting of our divine nature. It's not punishment, it's the necessary condition that makes individual experience possible. Think of it like this. Imagine you're pure white light, and you pass through a prism. You don't stop being white light, but you appear to become separate colors: red, blue, green, yellow. Each color maintains all the properties of the original white light, but experiences itself as distinct and separate. Only by remembering its essential nature as white light can each color understand its unity with all the others. This is what happened when your soul chose to incarnate. You didn't leave God to come to earth. You entered into a dimension where God could experience individualized existence through your unique perspective. But the prism of physical reality created the illusion that you are separate from Source, that you must somehow find your way back to a God you never actually left. The 7 divine lessons you're about to discover aren't methods to reach God, they're ways to remember the connection that already exists. Each lesson dissolves another layer of the spiritual amnesia, until you recognize yourself as an individualized expression of the one divine life, temporarily focused through human form for the purpose of growth, service, and love. This recognition changes everything. Prayer becomes communion, seeking becomes being. Spiritual practice becomes remembering rather than achieving. You stop trying to get God's attention and realize you are God's attention, focused in this particular time and place. But here's where most people encounter their first major obstacle. They've been praying incorrectly their entire lives, which actually reinforces the illusion of separation rather than dissolving it. The first divine lesson reveals how to completely revolutionize your prayer life in a way that transforms seeking into finding. In a documented case preserved in the RE archives, a woman came to Edgar Cayce in desperation. She had been praying fervently for 20 years, praying for healing, praying for financial relief, praying for her troubled marriage, praying for her children's safety. Despite her sincere faith and countless hours spent in supplication, her prayers seemed to disappear into an empty sky. When Edgar entered his trance state, the Christ consciousness spoke through him with gentle but revolutionary clarity. The entity has been praying backward for 2 decades. Praying backward? What could that possibly mean? The reading explained that most human prayer consists of talking to God, asking, pleading, bargaining, demanding, even thanking. But true prayer, divine communion, is primarily about listening for God's voice within you. This isn't passive meditation or empty silence. It's active attunement to the frequency of source consciousness itself. Here's what happens in conventional prayer. You project your consciousness upward and outward toward some distant concept of God. You petition this external deity to intervene in your circumstances. You speak, God listens. God hopefully responds with changed conditions in your external world. But Edgar Cayce's readings revealed that every soul has a direct communication channel with the divine, not external to you, but as the deepest core of your own consciousness. God doesn't exist somewhere up there separate from you. God exists as the very awareness through which you experience existence itself. When you shift from petitioning to listening, prayer becomes communion. When prayer becomes communion, communion becomes the doorway to direct knowing. Instead of asking God for guidance, you become still enough to recognize that divine wisdom is already flowing through your consciousness in every moment. This is why Jesus said, "Be still and know that I am God." The knowing doesn't come from thinking about God or talking to God. It comes from becoming still enough to recognize God as the eternal I am that is your deepest identity. The woman in Edgar's reading was instructed to spend her prayer time not in speaking, but in listening, not in requesting, but in receiving, not in reaching upward, but in turning inward to the divine presence that had been speaking to her through her own deepest intuition all along. Within 6 months, every situation she had been praying about began to transform, not through miraculous, external intervention, but through the divine guidance she received when she learned to listen for God's voice within her own consciousness. But this raises an important question. If divine guidance is always available through inner listening, why do so many spiritual seekers struggle with self-doubt and spiritual inadequacy? The second lesson reveals a truth about spiritual development that will completely challenge your understanding of selfishness and service. The most counterintuitive teaching in Edgar Cayce's readings might also be the most liberating. To truly serve God, you must first serve the God within yourself. This isn't narcissism or spiritual self-indulgence. It's recognition of a cosmic principle that most religious traditions have completely misunderstood. Consider this documented case from the readings. A minister came to Edgar Cayce feeling spiritually exhausted and emotionally depleted. He had dedicated his entire life to serving others, visiting the sick, counseling the troubled, leading worship services, organizing charity work. His days were consumed with meeting other people's needs, yet he felt increasingly distant from God and resentful of the demands placed upon him. The reading that came through Edgar was both shocking and illuminating. The Christ consciousness explained that the minister's service had become a form of spiritual bypassing. By focusing entirely on external service, he had neglected the divine relationship within himself. His ministry had become a way of avoiding his own spiritual development rather than expressing it. Here's the cosmic principle the readings revealed. Your personal spiritual development directly impacts the collective consciousness of humanity. When you heal your own sense of separation from Source, you automatically assist others in healing theirs. When you develop your own capacity for divine communion, you become a living bridge that helps others access their own divine connection. This is what Edgar Cayce called sacred selfishness. The understanding that your individual enlightenment is actually a service to humanity. Not because you become someone special or superior, but because consciousness is fundamentally interconnected. As you raise your own spiritual frequency, you automatically lift the entire field of human awareness. Think of it like tuning forks. When one tuning fork begins to vibrate at its pure frequency, other tuning forks nearby automatically begin to resonate at that same frequency. You don't serve others by depleting your own spiritual resources. You serve others by maintaining such a clear connection to divine consciousness that your very presence reminds them of their own divine nature. The minister was guided to spend the first hour of each day in spiritual attunement, not for the purpose of preparing to serve others, but for the sake of nurturing his own relationship with the divine. He was told to treat his personal spiritual development as the foundation of all service rather than something separate from it. This meant saying no to some external demands in order to say yes to his inner divine relationship. It meant protecting time for prayer, meditation, study, and spiritual communion even when others needed his attention. It meant recognizing that self-care was soul care, and soul care was ultimately planetary healing. Within months, his ministry was transformed, not because he was doing more external service, but because the quality of his presence had changed. People began to experience divine peace simply by being in his company. His words carried a transmission of Christ consciousness that awakened spiritual remembering in everyone who heard him speak. This is the paradox of spiritual service. The more you nurture your own divine connection, the more powerfully you serve as a conduit for God's love to reach others. But this personal spiritual work reveals something profound about how divine guidance actually operates in daily life. Something that most seekers completely misunderstand about signs and synchronicities. Sarah had been seeking divine guidance about a major career change for months. She prayed, meditated, asked for signs, but felt as though heaven was silent. Then, in a single week, 3 different people mentioned the same company to her. A book about her desired field fell off a library shelf as she walked by. She found a job posting for her dream position posted exactly 24 hours after it went live. Coincidences, or something more? Edgar Cayce's readings revealed that God communicates constantly through what he called the language of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that serve as divine guidance for those who know how to read them. But here's what most people miss. Synchronicities aren't random signs scattered throughout your experience. They're responses to your level of spiritual attunement. The readings explained that consciousness operates like a radio transmitter. When your personal frequency aligns with divine frequency, you automatically begin broadcasting a signal that magnetizes corresponding experiences. The universe doesn't send you signs. Your consciousness, when properly attuned, literally draws to itself the experiences, people, and opportunities that match your spiritual frequency. This is why some people seem to live in a constant flow of meaningful coincidences, while others rarely notice any signs at all. It's not that God plays favorites. It's that some people have learned to maintain the inner frequency that makes synchronistic guidance possible. In one documented case, a woman asked Edgar Cayce why she never received divine guidance through signs and synchronicities. The reading revealed that her mind was so busy with worry and mental chatter that she was broadcasting on dozens of different frequencies simultaneously. The divine guidance was present, but her receiver was tuned to static. The solution wasn't to ask for bigger signs, it was to quiet her mind enough to receive the subtle guidance that was already flowing through her experience. When she learned to maintain inner stillness and trust, her entire life became a continuous stream of meaningful coincidences, guiding her toward her highest path. But here's the deeper principle the readings revealed. Synchronicity isn't magical thinking, it's cosmic mechanics. Your consciousness literally influences the organization of events in your experience. When you maintain alignment with divine consciousness, you participate in the same creative intelligence that organizes the movement of planets, the flow of seasons, and the intricate dance of cause and effect throughout the universe. This divine GPS system operates through multiple channels simultaneously. Sometimes guidance comes through outer synchronicities, meetings, signs, overheard conversations. Sometimes it flows through inner knowing, sudden insights, intuitive impulses, dreams, and visions. Often it manifests through what seem like obstacles or delays that redirect you toward a better path than the one you were pursuing. The key is developing the spiritual sensitivity to recognize divine guidance in all its forms. This requires releasing attachment to how you think guidance should appear and remaining open to how it actually manifests in your unique experience. But learning to receive divine guidance raises an uncomfortable question that most spiritual teachings avoid. What about the times when synchronicity seems to lead you into difficult or even painful experiences? The fourth lesson reveals something profound about divine connection that will challenge everything you think you know about spiritual worthiness and divine protection. Marcus had been on a spiritual path for 15 years when his life completely fell apart. His marriage ended in a painful divorce. His business collapsed due to a partner's betrayal. He lost his home and found himself struggling with depression and what felt like a crisis of faith. How could someone so dedicated to spiritual growth experience such devastating losses? When he finally consulted Edgar Cayce's readings about soul purposes and life lessons, he discovered something that revolutionized his understanding of spiritual development. The Christ consciousness explained that souls sometimes orchestrate intense challenges not as punishment, but as accelerated spiritual curriculum designed to shatter the ego's illusion of control and open the heart to deeper divine dependence. This is Edgar Cayce's most controversial teaching. Your perceived spiritual failures are actually sacred initiations designed by your soul to accelerate divine connection. Every addiction, depression, relationship failure, or moral compromise contains a hidden curriculum leading you back to God. This isn't spiritual bypassing or avoiding personal responsibility. It's recognizing that the soul operates from a much broader perspective than the personality. While the ego sees challenges as problems to be solved, the soul sees them as opportunities for growth to be embraced. The readings revealed that some souls choose particularly difficult incarnations precisely because intense experiences create rapid spiritual development. Financial struggle can teach divine dependence. Relationship loss can open the heart to unconditional love. Health challenges can awaken spiritual priorities. Moral failures can cultivate humility and compassion. Marcus discovered that his business collapse occurred because his soul was ready for a completely different kind of service, one that required the humility and wisdom that only comes through facing personal powerlessness. His divorce, painful as it was, freed him from a relationship dynamic that had become spiritually stagnant for both partners. His financial losses stripped away external securities so he could discover the internal security that comes from divine reliance. This doesn't mean that suffering is necessary for spiritual growth, but it does mean that when challenges arise in your spiritual journey, they often contain sacred teachings that wouldn't be available through easier circumstances. Your darkest moments frequently precede your greatest spiritual breakthroughs because they force you to surrender the pretense of self-sufficiency and reach for divine grace. The key is learning to recognize the spiritual curriculum hidden within difficult experiences. Instead of seeing challenges as evidence of spiritual inadequacy or divine abandonment, you can begin to recognize them as intense love expressing itself through whatever means necessary to bring you home to your divine nature. This process of shadow integration, embracing both the light and dark aspects of your spiritual journey, prepares your consciousness for the fifth lesson, which involves a practice so profound it can literally transform your consciousness overnight. But this practice requires the kind of humility and surrender that only comes through integrating your shadow experiences with compassion rather than shame. In the deepest readings Edgar Cayce ever gave, he revealed a practice that represents the pinnacle of spiritual development. The conscious identification with the Christ consciousness that exists as your deepest identity. This isn't visualization or imagination. It's the recognition and embodiment of your divine nature while still maintaining human personality and individual awareness. The practice begins with understanding that Christ consciousness isn't the exclusive property of Jesus of Nazareth. It's the universal principle of perfect union between individual awareness and divine consciousness. The same spiritual condition that Jesus embodied, but which represents the ultimate potential of every human soul. Here's how Edgar Cayce described the practice in one of his most profound readings. In meditation, move beyond asking God for anything. Move beyond even talking to God. Instead, rest in the recognition that God is the very consciousness through which you are aware of being aware. Feel into this divine awareness as the deepest core of your identity. This practice involves 3 stages of deepening recognition. First, you recognize that your awareness itself is divine in nature. Not the contents of your awareness, your thoughts, feelings, sensations, or perceptions, but the pure awareness that observes all experience. This awareness has never been born and will never die. It's not located in your brain or body. It's the timeless, spaceless consciousness through which all experience occurs. Second, you recognize that this pure awareness is not separate from the universal divine consciousness. Just as waves are not separate from the ocean, your individual awareness is not separate from the infinite awareness that is God. You are not a drop of consciousness separate from an ocean of divine consciousness. You are the one divine consciousness appearing as an individual perspective. Third, you begin to live from this recognition rather than from the personality sense of being a separate entity seeking connection with God. Instead of trying to connect with divine consciousness, you recognize yourself as divine consciousness temporarily focused through human form. This practice dissolves the final barrier between seeker and source. It reveals that what you've been searching for has been the very awareness through which you've been searching. The divine connection you've been seeking is the consciousness that has been seeking it. But here's what makes this practice so transformational. When you consistently rest in the recognition of your essential divine nature, every aspect of your human experience begins to transform automatically. Relationships become opportunities to love as God loves. Challenges become invitations to respond from divine wisdom. Work becomes service offered through your unique expression of divine consciousness. One woman who practiced this daily for 6 months reported that her entire life became a continuous spiritual experience. Not because her circumstances changed dramatically, but because her relationship to her circumstances was completely transformed. She was no longer a human being having occasional spiritual experiences. She had become divine consciousness, enjoying the adventure of human experience. This recognition naturally leads to the 6th lesson, which shows how this divine identification transforms the most ordinary activities into sacred practices. When you know yourself as divine consciousness in human form, every moment becomes an opportunity for communion with God. Janet was washing dishes when it happened. She had been practicing the divine merger meditation for several weeks, regularly experiencing profound states of communion during her formal spiritual practice. But as she stood at the kitchen sink, feeling warm, soapy water flow over her hands, watching the play of light through the window, something extraordinary occurred. She realized that the consciousness watching her wash dishes was the same divine consciousness she experienced in meditation. The awareness enjoying the simple sensory experience of warm water and clean plates was God consciousness itself, delighting in the simple pleasure of physical existence through her particular perspective. In that moment, washing dishes became as sacred as any formal religious ritual she had ever experienced. This is what Edgar Cayce meant when he taught that every mundane activity becomes a divine sacrament when performed with Christ consciousness awareness. The readings revealed that God doesn't exist only in churches, temples, or meditation sessions. Divine consciousness is fully present in every moment of ordinary experience, waiting to be recognized and appreciated. When you live from the understanding that you are divine consciousness temporarily focused through human form, washing dishes becomes God washing dishes through you. Paying bills becomes divine consciousness managing physical world resources. Having conversations becomes God communing with God through the apparent dialogue between two people. This recognition transforms ordinary existence into continuous spiritual practice. Your job becomes your temple, where you offer service as an expression of divine love. Your relationships become your teachers, reflecting back aspects of divine nature that you're ready to recognize and embody. Your daily challenges become your initiations into deeper divine understanding. But this isn't about pretending that everything is perfect or denying the genuine difficulties of human existence. It's about recognizing the divine consciousness that experiences both joy and sorrow, success and failure, health and illness, connection and loneliness. This consciousness remains unchanged and unaffected by the content of experience while being fully present to all of it. The readings emphasize that this sacred, ordinary awareness actually makes you more effective in the material world, not less. When you bring divine consciousness to practical activities, they tend to flow more smoothly and produce better results. This isn't magical thinking. It's the natural effect of bringing focused, loving attention to whatever you're doing. One man reported that after several months of practicing sacred ordinary awareness, his work performance improved dramatically, not because he was working harder, but because he was bringing divine consciousness to every task. His presence became so peaceful and centered that colleagues began seeking his input on problems they couldn't solve. His desk became an unofficial place of refuge for anyone having a difficult day. This transformation happens naturally when you recognize that there's no separation between spiritual practice and daily life. Every moment offers the opportunity for divine communion. Every activity can be an expression of your deepest spiritual understanding. Every interaction becomes a chance to embody the love, wisdom, and presence that you've discovered through formal spiritual practice. But the ultimate purpose of recognizing the sacred in ordinary life becomes clear in the seventh and final lesson, which reveals why souls choose to incarnate in the first place. The answer will show you that all spiritual development ultimately leads to a form of service that transforms both you and the world around you. Thomas had spent 20 years pursuing spiritual enlightenment. He had practiced every meditation technique, attended countless workshops, read hundreds of books about consciousness and divine connection. His inner experiences were profound, states of bliss, mystical visions, direct communion with divine presence. But something was missing. When he consulted EDGAR CAYCE'S readings about soul purpose, the guidance that came through was both challenging and illuminating. The entity has been seeking God in order to escape the world. But souls incarnate not to escape the world, but to transform it through embodying divine consciousness in human form. This reveals the ultimate purpose of all spiritual development. Service as an expression of divine love in action. Every lesson you've learned, every practice you've mastered, every recognition you've gained about your divine nature, all of it culminates in becoming a conduit for divine love to flow into the physical dimension. The readings made clear that enlightenment isn't an escape from human responsibility. It's the foundation for more effective service. When you know yourself as divine consciousness in human form, your service becomes God serving God through the unique expression of your personality, talents, and circumstances. This divine service isn't necessarily about grand gestures or dramatic acts of heroism. Most often it's about bringing the presence of the divine into every interaction, relationship, and situation you encounter. It's about being so rooted in divine consciousness that your very presence becomes a transmission of peace, love, and spiritual remembering to everyone around you. The readings revealed that this is actually why souls choose to incarnate at all. Not to learn lessons or pay karmic debts, though those things may happen. The primary purpose is to serve as conscious bridges between the divine and physical dimensions, allowing spirit to express itself through matter in increasingly beautiful and harmonious ways. When Thomas began to approach his spiritual development as preparation for service rather than escape from the world, everything changed. His meditation practice became a way of receiving divine guidance about how to best serve each day. His mystical experiences became sources of wisdom and compassion that he could offer to others. His spiritual gifts began manifesting as practical abilities to help people heal, grow, and remember their own divine nature. This shift from seeking to serving resolves the ultimate spiritual paradox. The more you give divine love away, the more you experience it yourself. Service becomes the completion of the circle that begins with recognizing your own divine nature. You discover your divinity not to keep it as a private treasure, but to share it as a gift that benefits all life. But divine service must be balanced with wisdom and protection. True spiritual mastery involves understanding not just how to embody divine love, but how to do so without becoming depleted, manipulated, or spiritually ungrounded. The readings contained crucial warnings about the potential dangers of spiritual development that every seeker needs to understand. Elena had been following EDGAR CAYCE'S teachings for 3 years when she noticed something troubling. She was becoming increasingly detached from practical responsibilities, assuming that divine consciousness would somehow handle her finances, relationships, and health without her active participation. When challenges arose, she would retreat into meditation rather than taking appropriate action in the physical world. Her spiritual experiences were genuine and profound, but she was using divine connection to avoid human responsibility rather than to enhance her effectiveness in the material dimension. The readings contained explicit warnings about this pattern, which EDGAR Cayce called mystical inflation, mistaking spiritual experiences for spiritual development, or using divine connection as an escape from the practical demands of incarnate existence. True divine connection actually makes you more effective in the material world, not less. When you're genuinely aligned with Christ consciousness, you become more present to practical responsibilities, more skillful in handling everyday challenges, and more compassionate in dealing with people who haven't yet awakened to their divine nature. The readings warned against several specific dangers that can derail authentic spiritual development. First, spiritual superiority, believing that your divine connection makes you special or advanced compared to others. This attitude actually separates you from the humility and love that are the true signs of spiritual development. The readings emphasize that genuine spiritual growth increases your capacity for compassion and service, not your sense of being different or superior. Second, spiritual bypassing, using meditation, prayer, or mystical experiences to avoid dealing with practical responsibilities, emotional healing, or psychological growth. Divine consciousness includes and transcends human experience rather than escaping from it. True spiritual development integrates all levels of your being. Third, losing grounding in physical reality, becoming so focused on spiritual dimensions that you neglect your body, relationships, work, or material responsibilities. The readings taught that incarnation is a sacred opportunity to express divine consciousness through physical form, not to transcend physical existence. The protection against these dangers involves maintaining what the readings called balanced spiritual development. This means nurturing your divine connection while simultaneously taking full responsibility for your human experience. It means using spiritual insight to guide practical action rather than to replace it. Elena learned to approach her spiritual practice as preparation for more effective living rather than as an alternative to engaged living. Her meditation became a way of receiving guidance about practical decisions. Her mystical experiences became sources of wisdom for handling everyday challenges. Her divine connection empowered rather than escaped her human responsibilities. This balanced approach to spiritual development creates a foundation for understanding how divine connection directly impacts physical and emotional healing. When you maintain proper grounding while opening to divine consciousness, you become available for healing that operates simultaneously on spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical levels. Maria had been suffering from chronic fatigue for 5 years when she discovered EDGAR Cayce's teachings on spiritual attunement healing. Traditional medical treatments had provided limited relief, and she was beginning to lose hope for recovery. Then she learned about the connection between consciousness and physical healing that ran throughout Cayce's health readings. The readings revealed that every physical symptom corresponds to a spiritual or emotional pattern that can be addressed through divine attunement, not in a simplistic, positive thinking way, but through a profound understanding that consciousness is the organizing principle behind all healing. When Maria began practicing daily spiritual attunement, aligning her consciousness with divine consciousness through meditation, prayer, and recognition of her divine nature, something remarkable began to happen. Her body's innate healing intelligence activated in ways that had been dormant for years. This isn't faith healing in the traditional sense. It's scientific spirituality, recognizing that consciousness and matter are intimately connected, and that changes in consciousness naturally produce corresponding changes in physical experience. The readings explained that every cell in your body is responsive to the quality of consciousness flowing through it. When you maintain consistent attunement to divine consciousness, you literally bathe your physical form in healing frequencies that activate its natural capacity for regeneration, balance, and optimal function. But spiritual attunement healing works through specific principles that Edgar Cayce detailed across thousands of health readings. First, spiritual alignment creates the optimal inner environment for physical healing. When your consciousness is anchored in divine peace and love rather than in fear and stress, your nervous system shifts from survival mode into healing mode. Your body's repair mechanisms function more effectively when they're not constantly interrupted by fight or flight responses. Second, divine consciousness carries information about your body's perfect blueprint. Just as a seed contains the template for a fully grown plant, your consciousness holds the pattern of optimal health for your physical form. Spiritual attunement helps align your current physical condition with this divine template. Third, healing energy naturally flows through consciousness that is aligned with Source. When you maintain divine connection, you become a channel for healing forces that operate beyond your personal will or understanding. This healing energy can be directed toward yourself or offered to others through prayer, intention, and loving presence. Maria discovered that her chronic fatigue began improving not through forcing her body to heal, but through consistent spiritual practices that created the inner conditions where healing could occur naturally. Her daily attunement created space for divine intelligence to work through her system in ways that conventional treatments hadn't been able to access. Within 8 months, her energy levels had returned to normal. But more importantly, she had learned to maintain the kind of consciousness that supports ongoing health and vitality. She had discovered that physical healing and spiritual development are not separate processes, but aspects of the same fundamental movement toward wholeness. This understanding of consciousness-based healing connects directly to the broader principle of how divine grace works. Through the law of karma and personal responsibility, true healing always involves both spiritual alignment and appropriate practical action in perfect balance. David came to Edgar Cayce's readings carrying guilt about a mistake that had hurt several people years earlier. He had asked for forgiveness countless times, both from those he had harmed and from God. But the weight of his actions continued to create suffering in his current relationships and overall sense of spiritual worth. The reading he received revealed one of the most profound principles in all of Cayce's teachings: the delicate balance between accepting divine grace and taking full responsibility for the consequences of your choices. This balance represents the integration point where spiritual development becomes both practical and transformational. The Christ consciousness explained through Edgar that divine grace doesn't eliminate the learning opportunities created by past choices. It transforms how you experience them. When your consciousness aligns with divine consciousness, challenges become opportunities for grace to work through you, dissolving karma through love rather than working through it via suffering and resistance. This means that taking responsibility for past actions isn't about punishment or earning forgiveness through suffering. It's about allowing divine love to flow through you in ways that heal both yourself and others affected by your choices. Personal responsibility becomes a form of service rather than a burden of guilt. The readings revealed that karma itself is not a system of cosmic punishment, but a learning mechanism designed to help souls develop wisdom, compassion, and divine alignment. When you approach karmic experiences from divine consciousness rather than ego consciousness, they become accelerated opportunities for spiritual growth rather than prolonged cycles of suffering. David was guided to take specific actions that demonstrated both personal responsibility and divine grace in operation. He reached out to those he had harmed, not to ask for forgiveness again, but to offer whatever practical assistance might help heal the consequences of his past choices. He also committed to daily spiritual practice that would prevent similar mistakes in the future. But the most transformational aspect of his guidance was the instruction to stop seeing his past mistake as evidence of spiritual inadequacy. Instead, he was taught to recognize how the experience had developed humility, compassion, and wisdom that now enabled him to serve others who were struggling with similar challenges. This integration of personal will and divine will reveals that they ultimately align when the ego surrenders to the soul's higher wisdom. You discover that taking full responsibility for your choices is actually a form of spiritual surrender, allowing divine intelligence to work through your decisions rather than trying to control outcomes through personal will alone. The readings emphasized that this integration process is unique for every individual. Some souls learn primarily through service and joy. Others require more challenging experiences to develop the qualities their soul came to cultivate. Neither path is superior, both are expressions of divine love customized for each soul's specific curriculum. This understanding brings great comfort to spiritual seekers who feel discouraged by their apparent lack of progress or the continuing presence of challenges in their lives. Every soul is exactly where it needs to be in its spiritual development, and comparison with others often prevents recognition of your own unique journey toward divine realization. If you're listening to these teachings and feeling discouraged about your own spiritual development, please pause for a moment and receive this truth directly from EDGAR CAYCE'S most compassionate readings. You are exactly where you need to be in your spiritual journey. Not where your ego wants you to be, but where your soul has determined you need to be for optimal growth. The Christ consciousness that spoke through EDGAR consistently emphasized that every soul's path to divine connection is perfectly designed for that soul's specific lessons and service. The very fact that you're seeking spiritual truth with sincerity is evidence that your divine connection is already active and guiding your development.